Hello. I recently recorded a contribution towards one of the Pagan Federation's virtual moots with the theme of feeding the soul. After I'd sent it off, I realised I'd got two of my Greek myths mixed up and that my train of thought had derailed somewhere just outside of Doncaster. Normally, I upload the broadcasts I do for them onto my blog, but as I didn't do a particularly brilliant job of it, I thought I'd re-record it. The same general ideas, but try to keep it a little bit more focused on what it was that I wanted to say, but somehow didn't quite manage to say. I took the notion of feeding the soul in connection with the idea of not actual food, but how we feed our minds, how we feed things to our soul in terms of, particularly in terms of story. The myths, the legends, the personal narratives, the autobiographical tales, the whole broad spectrum of how we nurture or starve or overfeed, as the case may be, our spiritual existences through the medium of story. I wanted to start with the idea that, just as nutritionists have been saying for a long, long time, you are what you eat, so that also plays out within the idea that the stories we consume, particularly if we consume a lot of stories on a similar theme, feed, influence, shape our minds, shape our souls. That's nothing new as an idea. It's something without the soul word, usually just talking in terms of psychology rather than spirituality. It's an argument that's been made by a variety of different psychologists for a considerable period of time now. One particular example of one of the psychologists who's argued that school of thought is Eric Berne, the Canadian psychotherapist and theorist, who developed the idea of transaction analysis. I don't want to go too deeply into that because it's not especially relevant to this, but one of his ideas was that people have life scripts, which is just a sort of psychobabble for stories, life narratives. Ideas that we tell ourselves about the nature of our own lives, not necessarily about the nature of human existence generally, but the nature of our own particular life. Some people believe themselves to have a great calling in life and they'll follow that calling. Other people just have no idea where they're going and they meander around. Some people are convinced their life is destined to be great and fantastic and wonderful, and other people feel as if their life is going to be irrelevant and trivial and depressing and dreary. So people have lots of different ideas. Berne argued that there are 6 major stories that crop up again and again, and given that he came from a Freudian background, he picked up on Sigmund Freud's love of the classics of Greek myth, and he used the ideas, or some of the ideas from Greek myth, to describe these repeated patterns, these scripts. So he used things like the sword of Damocles and the torment of Tantalus, the if you like, the stagnation of Philomena and Baucis and so on. Sorry, Philemon and Baucis. Philomena. To illustrate these principles. So the one I'll use here is the story, excuse me, the story of Tantalus, in which a particularly horrible Greek king is condemned to be punished in Tartarus, in a sort of hellish existence, and he is placed in a pool of water. In one version it's wine, but usually it's water, which is up to his sort of chest. And there's all these wonderful grapes and succulent fruit dangling from vines just above him. Every time he lowers his head to take a drink of the water disappears down the plug hole. Every time he reaches up to get some of the fruit from the branches lift up out of his reach. So for the rest of eternity he is dying of starvation and thirst, but never quite dying because he's trapped in Tartarus. And the cure for his starvation, the cure for his thirst, is always just out of reach. He can see it, but he can never have it. And Berne said there are lots of people who are taught, usually by their parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, whoever, from a young age that that's what life is like. that you can see what you want, but there is a glass pane between you and it, and the thing you want is always just out of reach, always just beyond that glass wall or glass ceiling, or however you want to describe it. And so people who believe that, and that's the important point behind this, is that Burns said that you're not really doomed to have a life like that. You just convince yourself that you are. And if you convince yourself you are, then to all practical intents and purposes, you will keep sabotaging your own life to make it fit the pattern of the story you believe in. So those people, they go through life and they fall in love with people who are just out of their reach, or they're married, or they're unattainable in some other way. Or even if they're not really unattainable at all, that person convinces themselves that they don't dare proposition or approach the person they're in love with, and so in effect they become out of reach. That person wants the promotion at work, but every time they go for it, somehow it pulls away. And Burns' argument is that largely what's going on is that the individual behaves in such a way that they ruin their own chances, but they don't even realise that they're doing it. If you want to shift outside of the confines of atheist, non-spiritual psychology and consider that from a more spiritual angle within it, whether that's a pagan context or some other religious context, you could also say that if we convince ourselves of the truth of a story, we tend not only to engineer circumstances in our own lives, but we also attract other people who fit the story. It's that old idea of like attracting like, in a sense, that you believe something to be true, therefore you draw people to you who play out the roles in your story because it suits their character to do so. So you might indeed draw to you someone who considers you beneath them, and that's their story, but they're coming at it from a different angle. And so you all kind of dance around in this very destructive drama, which, to go through that experience once is not the end of the universe. But if your entire life is rather like one of those soap operas that just repeats the same old plot again and again and again, and all they ever do is change the actors, but the story is exactly the same, it becomes unbelievably monotonous and soul-destroying and destructive. He did say that there are good stories, creative stories, constructive stories, and the key to getting into a constructive story, to some extent it's luck that you're born to the kind of parents who teach you creative stories. But even if you're not that lucky, the key to it is self-awareness. You come to realise what stories you are telling yourself, and if you don't like them, you realise you have the power to stop the story and start a whole new one, a different type of story, the kind of story you do want your life to play out along. And that, I think, is quite critical. I did, for the PF broadcast, briefly mention Colette Dowling's Cinderella complex, and I'll recap that here before moving on to the bit I forgot to say with that PF broadcast. Colette Dowling picked up on those kind of ideas that Byrne was writing about, and her book The Cinderella Complex was very, very popular a few decades back. Still quite influential, but it doesn't sell in quite the numbers it used to sell in. Her argument was that stories can be gendered. So whereas Byrne was saying things like the story of Damocles, the story of Hercules, the story of Tantalus could apply as much to a man or to a woman or to someone who was in the middle, genderqueer or whatever, she was saying, Dowling, that some stories are geared if you're a particular gender. So there are little girls' stories and there are little boys' stories. And you tend, as small children, whether it is mum and dad reading to you at bedtime, or whether it's you just being plonked in front of cartoons and Disney films and one thing and another, you tend to be exposed to the same sorts of stories on a very, very frequent basis. You hear the same thing again and again, just different variations of the same thing. And the Cinderella story is obviously the idea of this poor, put upon, much abused young girl who's treated as a drudge by her ugly sisters and wicked stepmother and her useless father, beaten, battered and exploited, but she's very good-hearted and she does all the cooking and the cleaning and the scrubbing, and then one day, lo and behold, her handsome prince comes along and saves her and she goes off to live in a castle, and it's brilliant. As a story, if you hear it once, it's just a story. It's not a big issue. But her point is that if you hear it again and again and again in all sorts of different variations, what fundamentally you are hearing as a young girl is the idea that if your life is terrible, awful and unpleasant, all you have to do is put up and shut up, and eventually, years and years and years down the line, some wonderful man will come along and rescue you. And then everything will be perfect because you'll have a big house and a big car and a big this and a big that, and it'll be smashing. And no doubt there are women in the world for whom that has worked out, that they have found some rich man and gone off and had a lovely love. But Dowling's point is that those kind of fairy tale endings are very, very rare. And B, even if you do get that sort of fairy tale romance, is it the ideal solution? Would it not be better for women to be strong and independent and say, well, I don't like my life, it's horrible, therefore I will change my life, I will take charge, I will become the active, dynamic principal in my life, I'll sort it out, and then romance, if it happens, is a bonus rather than a salvation. And that's obviously as true whether you're talking about straight women, lesbians, bisexual, and whatever. So whether it's a handsome prince or a handsome princess that you're waiting for, the point is that you shouldn't wait for them. You should get on, sort your life out, and when you do find romance, they see you as a strong person, not as some poor benighted little drip that has to be rescued. So that's that kind of idea that fairy tales, children's stories, the plots of soap operas and novels and what have you, often promote strong gender stereotypes, which aren't always healthy, and encourage passivity in women, and likewise encourage problematic behaviour in men as well. So it's a problem in both ways. What I'd like to add to that is that when we come to religion, whether it's pagan religions or other religions, all of those religions have stories. They have big major stories, and then they have subsidiary stories. So, for example, if we're thinking Christianity, obviously you've got the whole birth, mission and crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus as the big central story, but then the subsidiary stories are the tales of the apostles and the saints and the various other figures in the history of the church who've come and gone, and some of them done wonderful things and some of them not. And the history of the church as an organisation, whether you're thinking the Catholic Church, the Orthodox churches, the Anglican churches, whatever else, they each have their own stories of how they were founded, how they developed, how they progressed around the world. So there's a whole kind of the big story, and then there's all these subsidiary stories. The same is true within paganism. Paganism is a broad school, and it's easier to think in terms of individual forms of paganism. So you could say within heathenry, you've got your big major stories of Odin and Thor and Frigga and Frey, and then you have subsidiary stories of how the battles, for example, between St. Olaf and the persecution of all the heathens centuries ago, and you've got stories of how your particular hearth or group formed and founded, and when it started, and who joined and who left, and the kind of smaller scale stories that are woven around the tradition of your style of paganism, as well as the big mythical stories. Likewise, the big mythical tales of Egypt, of Greece, of Ireland, of Wales. Within Wicca, the stories there are more recent in design, more kind of general in a sense, and quite heavily influenced by ideas of people like Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell and so on. But you still got those sort of Wheel of the Year stories of the goddess giving birth and marrying the whole god and so on and so forth. And then you have the stories of how your particular coven started, or how your particular brand of Wicca started in your Gardnerian. You've got stories of Gerald Gardner, Doreen Valiente, and so on. Other types of Wicca have other characters that the stories coalesce around. And you yourself, which is an important point to bear in mind, you yourself add to that. You may perhaps never be some big famous author with hundreds and thousands of people around the world buying your books, but even if you are just that one member who joins that group and you add to it and do well or do badly, as the case may be, you become part of the story of the group. whether on a small scale or a more dramatic scale. And it's recognizing that you are part of the story, you're contributing to it, you're a character in the ongoing saga. And that's always worth bearing in mind that you are, and therefore be a good character, add to the story in a positive way rather than being a villain of the piece or creating problems or just dissipating into the wallpaper because you're hardly there at all. But also that within that context, we are imbibing important stories. Most pagans these days are converts. A relatively small number of people are born to pagan families and raised with pagan stories from the cradle upwards, the way they are in, say, Islam or Christianity or Judaism, where the vast majority of people are born to it and raised in it and very familiar with those stories. If you are a Christian, for example, you got the story of Christ's suffering on the cross. And I've known quite a lot of Christians over the years who have been through terrible problems in their lives, illnesses, divorce, bereavement, losing their jobs, financial crises, all those kinds of things. And for many of them, not all of them, but many of them, the idea that their suffering is an echo of Christ's suffering is a factor that helps them see that suffering in a different light. And they feel that their story is echoing the story of Jesus. And so that it's not just random suffering, it becomes part of a bigger picture, part of a bigger pattern, and it helps to shape that. I've also known Christians who've said they've had times in their lives when they've been very tempted to do perhaps slightly dodgy things, and they've resisted it, and for them it's brought to mind the story of Christ during his 40 days in the wilderness and the devil tempting him with all of the wealth of the world and the rest of it. The idea of having to go through a trial, of facing worldly temptations and resisting it in order to do something better. And so that, again, when those sorts of incidences have happened to them, they've not just popped up in isolation as an individual experience, they've been seen as an expression of a bigger story, a greater story, so that they, as Joe Bloggs, are weaved into the bigger story of Jesus and the trials of Jesus. If that's true of Christians, it's also true of Muslims, it's true of Buddhists, it's true of Hindus, how people find themselves weaved into bigger stories, the stories that mean so much to their lives. It's also true of secular people and the big stories that influence secular culture. But to think about for us as pagans, what stories profoundly influence you? Are you drawn to this particular major myth or that particular major myth? Generally speaking, we've got quite a lot to choose from, in a sense. If you are a Druid, there's dozens and dozens of big Irish myths and Welsh myths and so forth. So you might prefer this story rather than that story. And what is it that draws you to this story rather than that story? And how will that impact your life? If you come to view your life through the lens of the story, so you particularly identify with Cuchulainn or Finn McCall or Briege or Danu or whoever it is that you're drawn to identify with, is their story becoming your story? And are you, in a sense, becoming part of their story? Is that a good thing? Always. I've known a few heathens who follow Odin who often say he puts them through the ringer. And they feel themselves, just as he had to pluck out his eye and hung upside down from the world tree to gain the knowledge of the runes. I've known a few Odinists say that they have been obliged to make huge sacrifices in their own life to gain knowledge and wisdom later, and seeing echoes between Odin's story and their own personal domestic story. Not that you can always pick and choose stories. A lot of pagans say they feel as if the story is choose them, or multiple the gods in the stories choose them, and it's a sort of they're not quite strong-armed into it, but they are definitely summoned into that story, into the realm of that deity. But perhaps being aware of that as it's happening means that you'll start to see how that story will begin to influence your life, how it will begin to play out, how it will begin to resonate. If you genuinely don't like the way your life is going, maybe it's time to think about the stories you're telling, how you fit into that, Whether those stories are grand, mythical, spiritual sagas from the ancient world, or whether it's something a bit more recent. Say, for example, The Ugly Duckling from Hans Christian Andersen. There's a lot of people in the world who look in the mirror and don't like what they see in the mirror. They think of themselves as ugly and weird and peculiar and boring and this and that and the other. Other people may see them in a much more positive light, but all they see is something negative. And maybe one thing to bear in mind when you're going through that negativity is that perhaps you're in the ugly duckling phase, and that next week, next month, next year, whenever, you will have the beautiful swan part of the story, where you'll change, you'll develop, you'll transform in some way, and you'll become the beautiful thing. Which does mean that you are kind of waiting for it, and that waiting could go on for an awful long time for some people. But at least there is a positive to look towards, and a recognition that you maybe have to take charge of your own inner development to enable that sort of blossoming to come to pass. And whether you're seeing stories of that nature, or maybe even a very modern story, you really identify with Doctor Who or some other modern day character, and you see the story of your life echoing to the story of their fictional works. Where they go is where you're kind of following, in a sense. Whether you're following because they exert some inexplicable spiritual power, or whether it's more of an unconscious thing that your mind has sort of, a bit like a fledgling hatching from an egg and imprinting on something. You have imprinted on that figure, and that's unconsciously where you are being drawn to become aware of that. So that if you don't like where you're being drawn to, you can make the conscious effort of changing and going somewhere else. And that's an interesting issue, because it's something that Byrne and all sorts of other people have suggested, that we need story. So you can't just say, I don't like this story, I'm dropping all stories, I'm never going to listen to another story again, and flouncing off in high dudgeon. Rather, it's replacing the negative with a positive. You get a similar sort of thing in, to use a bizarre analogy, within the realm of addiction. That if you take away one addiction and leave nothing, no behaviour to replace it, it's usually only a matter of time before spontaneously a new addiction arises. Rather, in order to have a genuinely beneficial effect, you need to replace one problem behaviour with a more constructive new behaviour to fill the void. The previous behaviour has taken up a lot of time and mental effort and emotional investment and all sorts of things. When it goes, it leaves a gap. That gap has to be filled, and it's better to fill it consciously and positively than just to leave it to fill up with whatever the hell it fills up with spontaneously, which could easily be something just as bad as the thing you got rid of. And making a conscious choice about a good positive story for your life, a good pattern for it to start following, and where you fit into that pattern. So it's trying to see it as something very constructive. At least it is if you pour your thought into it and become aware of it. One way of pouring thought into it to become aware is to share your story. In the Peathon, I just used that analogy that you can eat alone. You sit there with your pot noodle or whatever, which is fine, and nothing wrong with eating alone. Just there's nothing wrong with sitting quietly in a corner, reading a storybook, or watching your favourite film, or listening to the radio, and engaging with stories in that way. One of my favourite activities is reading by myself. But there's also a bonus to sharing food, to sharing story. Whether that's going along to some storytelling meeting and you sit in a room with a dozen other people and you listen to the storyteller, or you are the storyteller, or it's just sitting, chatting with friends and saying, well, this is my favourite story, this is what it means to me, have you read it, what does it mean to you? They may have a different angle on that story from the angle you have. That kind of sharing of tales, in whatever context you wish to do it, is the basis of a good friendship. It's the basis of breaking bread, of companionship, of bonding with other people who share the same stories and love the same stories and have a passion for the same story. That's a good balance to the eating alone, to the to the imbibing of a story by yourself is to imbibe it with others. Like going to the cinema with a friend so you can enjoy the film and then talk about it on the way home, rather than just walking home by yourself. You've got the sharing of it afterwards. And that's something which I think helps you to, all of us, to understand our stories, both in terms of how they help, but also in terms of how they potentially could hinder. And consider new stories. One week it's your friends come with you to your story, and the following week you go with them to their story. So you're being exposed to different stories, things you might not normally... Like going to a book club, you don't normally read westerns or romances or whatever it is. So you read one because the book club is doing it, and it shows you something you wouldn't normally bother with. You might hate it, but then again you might love it. It might give you a whole new direction to consider to go in. So it's thinking in those terms that, to quote from Doctor Who, we are all stories, so make it a good one, and understand how we become stories, how we become part of not just our own story, but how our story slots in to a much bigger, grander story. The story of our religious traditions, the story of our religious groups, the story of our cultures, the big picture. And making those stories conscious, I suppose, really is the key to what I'm trying to say here. That rather than just blundering through it, we become more like actors measuring the part, bringing life to it, making sure it's the part we want rather than the part we've stumbled into, because that's what we've been told to expect. Hopefully that's a bit more coherent than the one I did for the Pagan Federation, but there we go. Thank you for listening.